Ever since European explorers began to colonize America, the Native Americans have been oppressed and mistreated. When the United States became a country, the persecution of Native Americans did not stop. The U.S. ignored the natives' rights to their lands and continued to break its promises with the Indians. Once the American Indian Wars came to an end in 1924, Native Americans' rights and the U.S.'s responsibilities to them were overlooked. Beginning in the late 1960s and lasting until the late 1970s, one movement revitalized the Native Americans' fight for better rights and more respect. Native Americans were inspired by the African American civil rights movement and their own situation within the country. At the time, people still viewed Indians in a negative light, and the Indians' living standards were significantly worse than the rest of the country. The Red Power movement was instrumental in gaining better rights for Native Americans in the United States. Indian activists brought awareness to the public of the responsibilities the government had to Native Americans by emphasizing the government's lack of adherence to previous treaties. In 1968, the Red Power movement was born with the creation of the organization called the American Indian Movement, also referred to as AIM. AIM was founded by Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, Eddie Benton Benet, and George Mitchell, who were all prominent American Indians. AIM fought to revive Indian culture, keep Native American nations sovereign, win back lands they believe had been wrongly taken from them, and protect Indian rights.
They were attempting to point out how discrimination against Native Americans was still very present and prevalent and causing hardship.
On November 20th, 1969, a group of Native Americans occupied Alcatraz Island, which was located in the San Francisco Bay. The goal of the occupiers was to seize back the island, which they believed had been illegally taken from them. In addition, as stated by the occupation leader Dr. Lenata Boye, Alcatraz was symbolic in the rebirth of Indian people to be recognized as a people, as human beings, whereas before we were not.
It represents to the Indians a sounding board where they can get the attention of the public, they get the attention of the press, and get the attention of government officials.
The occupation of Alcatraz lasted until the Indians were forcibly removed on June 11, 1971. Although Alcatraz was not given to the Indians, they did secure more rights and the government took more responsibility for its poor treatment of Native Americans. President Nixon addressed Congress during the occupation and proposed the idea of self-determination without termination. The occupation also resulted in the better education for Native Americans, the doubled funds for Indian health care, the establishment of the Office of Indian Water Rights, and the return of some of the Indian sacred lands. In the autumn of 1972, a band of American Indians began to march from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. Their goal was to protest for better rights that would help them maintain their sovereignty. The group wrote a 20-point paper which they submitted to Congress. Although Congress reviewed the paper, no laws were created or revised in favor of the Indians. To demonstrate how serious they were about their cause, the Native Americans occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs, also known as the BIA, in Washington, D.C. Once the protesters were finally removed from the Capitol, they had gained the attention of the public and increased Native American pride and unity. The next major Native American protest was the occupation of Wounded Knee from February 27th to May 8th, 1973. Wounded Knee was located on the Indian-owned Lakota Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Wounded Knee was also the location of the massacre of hundreds of Native Americans on December 29, 1890. The 1973 occupation served the purpose of protesting against the corruptness of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was an organization that was supposed to protect Indian rights. The protesters also wanted the government to look into the 371 treaties between the U.S. and the Indians that had been broken.
The federal police began shooting at us that first night, and we didn't even have no meeting set up yet. They didn't even know why we were there. They just started shooting.
The siege came to a close when gunfire between the Indians and the government killed an occupier. The Indians and the government made agreements that were supposed to end the corruptness of the BIA. To the Native Americans' dismay, the government did not uphold their promises, and many Indian protesters were arrested.
Never gave in to the United States. but we did on their promise to investigate corruption of the Wilson regime. But the government never kept its promise. It never intended to.
The final prominent event of the Red Power movement was the Longest Walk, which took place from February 11, 1978 to July 15th. The walk began on Alcatraz Island and went all the way to Washington, D.C. By the time they reached the Capitol, there were several thousand supporters of the Indians' cause. The purpose of the walk was to prevent the passing of legislation that would threaten Native American sovereignty. The protesters were successful and were able to get Congress to disapprove the threatening legislation. The short-term impact of the Red Power movement was it brought international attention to the grievances of the American Indians.
Are you interested in, quotes, the Red Revolution and power for the Red Indian, that kind of thing? Are you interested? Yeah. What are American people doing for Indians? That's a big question over in Europe.
Yeah.
The movement formed modern-day Native American activism along with increasing Indian pride. From the movement, Indians gained more rights such as religious freedom, water rights, land rights, better education, doubled funds for Indian health care, and the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act. The long-term impact of the movement was that the federal government began taking more responsibility for securing Native American sovereignty.
And few have been more marginalized and ignored by Washington for as long as Native Americans. And that's why I want you to know that I'm absolutely committed to moving forward with you and forging a new and better future together. It's a commitment that's deeper than our unique nation-to-nation relationship. It's a commitment to getting this relationship right so that you can be full partners in the American economy and so your children and your grandchildren can have an equal shot at pursuing the American dream.
I feel like the Native Americans were kind of treated unfairly because, they were living here peacefully and people just kind of came in and took their land over, and I feel like if someone were to do that to us right now, we wouldn't feel very happy about that.
They were treated poorly.
I don't know, it's just an awful way to treat anyone.
I think the Native Americans were treated wrong. This was their land. They were here first. They should have been allowed to live in peace on their land.
I think we should respect them more because of the history that they have within our country.
I think ultimately when you tell a culture that they're of no value, that their culture is worthless, and that you cannot speak your own language, you cannot follow your own traditions, you cannot honor your elders, you have to become white in order to be accepted. What it does to a culture is it makes everyone feel inferior.
The Native Americans were treated poorly by the U.S., and today they are still suffering from the mistreatment. The Red Power movement began the modern-day protest for better treatment of American Indians. It also shed light on the responsibility the government had to Native Americans, which is to respect the treaties that were made and to help Native Americans maintain their sovereignty while giving them an equal chance at success as other U.S. citizens have.